Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping back into the crosshairs of one of the most heavily scrutinized moments in modern history. We're talking about a day that kicked off with just immense, undeniable optimism and ended in a tragedy that quite literally sent shockwaves across the entire globe. This is the mystery that, well over 60 years later, still casts a very long, very dark shadow right over Dealey Plaza. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture it, November 22nd, 1963. It's a remarkably bright, sun-drenched afternoon in Dallas, Texas. The temperature is hovering right in the upper 60s, basically perfect weather for an open-car motorcade. You've got thousands of people lining the streets. It's this absolute sea of waving American flags, and the cheering crowds are reflecting right off the polished, deep blue of the president's 1961 Lincoln Continental. The atmosphere? Completely electric. Local press even reported that the president and the first lady were positively glowing. Absolutely no one in that crowd knew that within seconds, history was about to violently change course.
Now, to really grasp the weight of this moment, we have to look at the man sitting in that open car. At just 43 years old, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was America's youngest elected president. And you have to remember, after the very stoic, much older leadership of the 1950s, Kennedy brought this unprecedented wave of youth, charisma, and just sheer cinematic energy to the White House. He wasn't just another politician. To millions, he was the ultimate symbol of a new, modern American frontier. He was a beacon of hope for a nation that was rapidly transforming.
But, governing this new frontier was incredibly perilous. The man navigated the terrifying brinksmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment where the world stood literal inches away from all-out nuclear war. He pushed the nation aggressively into the space race, famously demanding that America land a man on the moon before the decade was even out. And of course, he governed during the incredibly tense and often violent early days of the civil rights movement. Yet, despite all of that immense global pressure and some incredibly bitter political divisions right at home, Kennedy was approaching the 1964 election as a remarkably popular figure.
All right, Chapter 1, Tragedy in Dealey Plaza.
As the early afternoon rolls in, the presidential motorcade is moving confidently through downtown Dallas. Secret Service agents are alert, they're scanning the windows and the crowds, but honestly, there's no specific anticipation of danger. And this brilliantly illustrates how quickly history can turn in mere minutes. Because at exactly 12:30 p.m., just as the limousine turns past the 7-story brick facade of the Texas School Book Depository and onto Elm Street, a sharp crack echoes across Dealey Plaza, then another, then a third. It's the absolutely distinct sound of a high-velocity rifle. Chaos erupts instantly. People are screaming, literally throwing themselves onto the grassy lawns, while others just freeze in pure shock. The president is critically struck and they immediately rush him to nearby Parkland Hospital, but the catastrophic damage is already done. At 1 p.m., America officially loses its president. In just 30 minutes, absolute triumph was completely swallowed by devastating tragedy.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Prime Suspect.
With sheer confusion and outright panic gripping the city, Dallas police quickly zero in on a 24-year-old former Marine who also happened to be a current employee at that book depository, Lee Harvey Oswald. And what follows is this frantic, bloody sequence of events playing out in real time. Just 45 minutes after the assassination, Oswald shoots and kills Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit on a residential street in Oak Cliff. Less than an hour after that, an intense police dragnet corners him, and they literally drag him out of a local movie theater. At this point, America thinks it finally has its man. But 2 days later, the completely impossible happens. As millions are watching live on television, which, by the way, was a historic first for national broadcasting, a local Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby slips past heavily armed guards into the police station basement, and he shoots Oswald right at point-blank range.
So suddenly, the only suspect was dead. And with him, many believed, the truth died as well. That takes us into Chapter 3, The Warren Commission. The entire nation was basically reeling. So to prevent panic and try to restore some faith in the government, newly sworn-in President Lyndon B. Johnson immediately orders a massive federal investigation. This becomes known as the Warren Commission, led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. After months of combing through evidence, conducting witness interviews, and running ballistics, their finalized official conclusion was definitive. They stated that Lee Harvey Oswald acted completely alone using a Mandikar Carcona rifle. They concluded that exactly 3 shots were fired from the 6th floor of the depository, and they said that one of those bullets, the one often controversially called the magic bullet, caused multiple simultaneous injuries to both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. So the crucial point is their ultimate conclusion: there was no conspiracy and no second gunman. Case closed.
But, as you might guess, closing the case wasn't quite that simple. Almost immediately, this massive chasm opened up between the government's official report and the American public. I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of an average citizen back in 1963, the sheer surreal nature of these events was profoundly difficult to process. People just weren't convinced. Citizens pointed to the infamous Zapruder home movie, that 8mm film capturing the terrifying moments in incredibly graphic detail. They pointed to witnesses on the ground who swore up and down that they heard shots echoing from entirely different directions. And they pointed to massive, lingering questions that they felt the Warren Commission seemingly glossed over in its rush to reassure the country. The official ink might have been dry, but the public jury was decidedly still out.
Let's move to Chapter 4, Decades of Doubt, and see how this builds. This profound disconnect sparked a cultural aftermath of intense skepticism that honestly continues right up to today. You know the saying, nature abhors vacuum. Well, when people feel they lack the full truth, countless theories rush in to fill that void of certainty. Some pointed fingers directly at the CIA, citing rogue factions internally that were angered by Kennedy's foreign policy. Others strongly suspected the mafia, supposedly retaliating against the administration's unprecedented crackdown on organized crime. Given the boiling tensions of the Cold War and Oswald's own known political sympathies, a lot of folks believed the Soviet Union or Cuba actually orchestrated the hit. And perhaps most famously of all, acoustic analyses and eyewitness accounts fueled the incredibly enduring belief of a second shooter hidden right behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And look, these aren't just fringe ideas. Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans still believe there was a broader conspiracy at play here.
However, there's one undeniable, sobering fact we absolutely have to highlight. Despite more than 60 years of countless independent probes, acoustic tests, newly declassified document dumps, and massive government investigations, no alternative theory has ever been conclusively proven. The assassination of JFK firmly remains one of history's most fiercely debated events, precisely because the absolute, irrefutable certainty that people desperately crave, it simply does not exist.
It's actually kind of remarkable to think about the number 3 in all of this. John F. Kennedy served as president for less than 3 years. Exactly 3 shots were fired in Dallas. Yet his impact on the world was just enormous. His vision inspired an entire generation, and his sudden, violent death permanently shattered America's innocence. Even if you weren't alive in 1963, the cultural ripples of that dark afternoon still profoundly affect how we view truth, power, and our own government today. In a lot of ways, it's the genesis of modern public skepticism.
We've walked through the optimistic arrival, the chaotic tragedy that followed, the stunning live television death of the prime suspect, and the decades of endless investigations and doubt. Yet, as the dust of history continues to settle over Dealey Plaza, one haunting question still echoes for us all. What really happened in Dallas?